Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome back to Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and the latest news today is the EU has now agreed to implement the US trade pact after President Trump made his tariff threats. So now the European Union has agreed to move forward with implementing a major trade pact with the United States. And this comes after we saw this entire thing play out with tariff threats all of last year. And essentially, President Trump threatened that there will be higher tariffs if the European Union failed to act before July 4th. And so that's around the corner. And now the agreement is designed to stabilize the nearly $2 trillion transactional trade relationship between the United States and the European Union. But it also exposes deep division within Europe because essentially to get to this term, there was some internal conflict in the European Union. This deal is showing that under the agreement, the EU will lower or eliminate tariffs on many US industrial goods, agricultural products, and seafood imports, while the US will cap most tariffs on European exports at 15%. This deal was originally negotiated in 2025, last year, during talks where President Trump and the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, they made this agreement last year, but this really essentially fast forwarded because President Trump put pressure on Europe to move on this in terms of the agreement accelerated because of this pressure of higher tariffs unless it was met before the deadline of July 4th, which is of Independence Day for America. And this year is the 250th anniversary of the United States. So now this specific contention was based on European auto exports, which the European Union failed to implement the pact quickly enough if that were to take place. So any European auto, you're talking about your Mercedes-Benz, your BMWs, your Audis, your Porsche, and, all the top brands from Europe essentially would have a big tariff on it. So the Europeans essentially, they feared to have a trade war with the United States, have any manufacturing disruptions, because when it comes to, for example, the European auto market, they heavily rely on American consumers. And that would create a backlash on economic instability and manufacturing disruptions if there was a high tariff on those European products. And it would essentially outmarket them in America. And this is happening at the same time as, of course, there's economic instability because of the fragile global economy when it comes to energy prices, because of the Iran war, inflation, and slower industrial growth. So Europe added safeguards against Trump because essentially European lawmakers said that, they insist on this because they just don't have a trust for what President Trump may do. So these protective clauses are in place for when it comes to this agreement. That includes if there's any suspension, there is a suspension mechanism, there is an emergency safeguard clause, and what is termed as a sunset clause that ends the pact in 2029, unless it's renewed. Europe also reserves the right to reimpose tariffs if the US violates commitments or keeps certain metal tariffs excessively high. Now, this is interesting because with the European Union doing this agreement with the United States, perhaps it gives Canada some, something to look at to see what was successful to deal with Trump on these factors and what it needs to do for this CUSMA renegotiation that's around the corner. But this entire agreement essentially triggered what was an internal debate, right? You had countries like Germany, Spain, and the Nordic states, countries saying that they largely support the pact to protect exports and avoid any economic escalations. Meanwhile, France said, they argued that Europe was surrendering too much leverage to the United States and to President Trump's pressure tactics when it comes to its tariffs. And some critics also say that they describe the agreement as what would be a submission to the United States economic pressure. But to that, you have Trump using tariffs as a geopolitical weapon, and it worked when it came to the European Union. It's saying that, Prime Minister Mark Carney says that he will not let America or Trump dictate terms when it comes to the Kuzma review. But, when it comes to this broader story, it's showing that President Trump has increasingly used his tariffs as a strategic leverage, not just as an economic policy, to be able to have tariffs tied to trade, NATO spending, right? This whole 2% of GDP for NATO members, when it comes to energy purchases, when it comes to this entire thing on Greenland disputes and industrial policies for trade and geopolitical negotiations, essentially showing that economic warfare is becoming what would be central to global diplomacy under President Trump, who's really rewritten the rules of how things are done. And of course, there's a pressure of the Iran war that the European Union is already so exposed because of their heavy reliance on energy that comes out of the Middle East that, they needed to have this buffer. Now, Canada should be watching closely, right? Because this deal also raises major questions for Canada because Europe, Japan, and other allies are negotiating trade agreements with the Trump administration. And Ottawa is not even talking to the Trump administration on the Kuzma review that's around the corner. Canada's officials are really worried because Trump could use tariffs, border measures, which we've seen him do shortly after he got back into office last year, trade threats, and to perhaps extract concessions from Canada before the negotiations take place, right? So this is critical because we're seeing this at a time where Mexico's advanced their talks with the United States on Kuzma. They're on their second round of talks. Canada is not even on their first. Now, when it comes to the United States, big news there. A couple of things that have happened in the last few days that I think are going to impact, major on the elections, the midterm elections that are just in October. So announced just yesterday that the US government has agreed to permanently block the Internal Revenue Services, so the IRS, from pursuing certain tax claims involving the President Trump, and his family members and the Trump Organization as a part of a settlement that is tied to Trump's $10 billion lawsuit over a leak of his tax returns. So his tax returns were leaked. And if you recall, in the first election that, where he won in his first term, he refused to show his tax returns. And then what President Trump did was he launched a $10 billion lawsuit against the IRS. To this, the DOJ created the settlement, and this agreement also creates a nearly $1.8 billion anti-weaponization fund designed to compensate individuals claiming that they were unfairly targeted by the federal government. So this is what this is how this lawsuit was settled, with these two things, that the Trump family, the President Trump, the Trump Organization will not be exposed to any, tax claims. And this $1.8 billion, which is taxpayer funded, of this anti-weaponization fund, essentially this is unprecedented and it is potentially unconstitutional, which is what critics are saying that President Trump and his allies argued that this should represent accountability for years of politically motivated investigations. We saw that when President Trump, was out of office during the Biden years, he had a lot of challenges that came up for him. And so he's now said that there should be this anti-weaponization fund that should compensate, any sort of legal situations that people find themselves in that are politically motivated. And many would also maybe say that maybe this James Comey, the former FBI boss, now that he's going through an indictment, is that also politically motivated? So it's very interesting times as the U.S. Department of Justice has agreed to permanently block the IRS from pursuing tax claims or audits connected to Donald Trump, President Trump, his family, or the Trump organization. Can you imagine that the Department of Justice is permanently blocking the IRS from doing their job, which is to pursue tax claims and audits when required? So now this is an agreement, and this is obviously going to have constitutional challenges take place because this was a settlement of the $10 billion lawsuit against the IRS. And this agreement states that the United States government is, these are the terms, forever barred and precluded from examining or prosecuting certain past tax matters involving Trump, his sons, and affiliated businesses. So massive on this settlement. Of course, it's having backlash from critics of what this means. Why is the Justice Department making deals on behalf of a sitting president? And this is unprecedented type of deal. First of all, it's unprecedented to sue the IRS for $10 billion, then to have this, and that was potentially a tactic, right? And it's raising more concerns of the political influence that President Trump has on the DOJ, right? And the DOJ is now also creating this $1.8 billion anti-weaponization fund. Essentially, this is taxpayer dollars intended to compensate people claiming that they were unfairly targeted by the federal government. And this fund could potentially compensate Trump allies, conservative figures, January 6th defendants, and other, alleging that, there was a political prosecution taking place. And so this is very critical of what's taking place right now in the United States, which we've never seen before, as the Trump administration increasingly portrays the IRS or the FBI or the DOJ more as, having, more of an impact. And some of the things that they've done appear to be more politically driven attacks. So this is at a time where Congress is already preparing challenges. The Democrats in Congress are now demanding hearings, questioning the legality of this agreement with the DOJ and the IRS, and exploring court challenges. Some lawmakers are saying that this executive branch cannot legally grant permanent protection from future federal tax enforcements. That is just not a thing. And transparency groups and watchdog organizations are also preparing ethic complaints, constitutional challenges, and the Freedom of Information Act requests on some of this. But what it's showing is this story that could be very politically explosive in a midterm year, where you have, the presidential powers on DOJ authorities and what should be IRS oversight, using taxpayer money for some of the settlement, and what looks to be more of, politically charged sort of an agreement and retaliation claims. It is sending very dangerous expansion of executive powers of the president's office. And this is something to watch this year as we're seeing, all this take place. And this comes after what was revealed that, President Trump had 3,700 stock trades, in just the first 3 months of this year. This new financial disclosure raised a lot of ethics questions about revealing what President Trump's doing when it comes to his investment accounts that are tied to 3,700 stock trades. And this was all this year, the first 3 months, and the stock trades were major on Ymedia, Boeing, Intel, Oracle, and other companies directly impacted by Trump's administration's policies when it comes on the policies on AI, on China, on aerospace, industrial manufacturing. So the White House does insist that these investments are handled by an independently and outside managers, but critics are arguing that the scale and the timing of the trades really highlight concerns that was the president making laws, essentially, expanding his trades, buying, stock of these companies, and then making laws that would take the stock up of those companies, where then he would, personally have financial rewards. And personally, this would impact, obviously, President Trump's net worth, saying that while he's in office, his net worth is actually going through the roof than prior to being in the office. So this actually triggered warnings because his investments are not in a blind trust. Essentially, when you go into office, you put your investments in a blind trust. His are not. And even though the White House is saying that they are being executed independently by outside managers, but, Wall Street analysts are saying that, ethics experts and political observers are saying that these trades involve major AI companies, defense contractors, aerospace firms, software giants, and this industrial cooperation between President Trump's administration, him and Trump's policies are a red flag. We saw him take some of these CEOs to China with him on Air Force One. What does that say in terms of him buying the stock of those companies and then taking them on this summit with China, and what that did for the stock of those companies, right? So Ymedia is really interesting because, the disclosures showed that President Trump has major positions in terms of increased stocks in Nvidia, Boeing, Oracle, Microsoft, Dell, Intel, Amazon, Meta, and GE Aerospace. Some transactions reportedly ranged from $1 million to $5 million each, with dozens of large trades and thousands of smaller transactions where Wall Street analysts are describing as the activity as hedge fund level trading, right? So inside trading. And when you do hedge fund trading, they're saying that, by looking at this disclosure, this is the warning bell that they got. Like, for example, right, when it came to Nvidia, where Trump reportedly held $5 million in Nvidia stock, this was before his administration approved expanded exports of advanced AI chips to China, right? Approvals reported include sales of the AI chips to the Chinese firms, including Alibaba, JD.com, ByteDance, and Lenovo. Nvidia shares jumped after the approvals, fueling accusations of him, gaining personally and what would be a massive conflict of interest. When it comes to Boeing, well, trades also are under scrutiny because Trump also reportedly bought Boeing and GE Aerospace shares before later announcing a proposed Chinese purchase of about 200 Boeing aircrafts because of the two-day summit. So really, did President Trump go to China to essentially increase his portfolio by taking these CEOs and getting the Chinese counterparts to say, yes, we'll buy 200 Boeing aircrafts, which then with the possible expansion of like 750 planes, but that deal alone essentially was Boeing's largest order ever, while GE Aerospace would likely benefit through some of these engine contracts, maintenance, and long-term servicing revenues. So it increased the Boeing stock, and President Trump had stakes in that right before the announcement of some of these things. When it comes to Intel, well, that was another thing where some major political and investment focus there, where President Trump previously helped negotiate 10% of government stake in Intel worth about $9 billion as a part of what he said was efforts to rebuild American semiconductor manufacturing. But then Trump later said that the United States government should have taken an even larger Intel position. So he's even saying what he's doing. So this has created a lot of backlash of what's really happening when it comes to this conflict of interest, how this president is really prioritizing his own net worth while being in office, and of course some of the deals he just made on with the IRS on him not being exposed to his tax claims and his sons and the Trump organization. So really using his position to benefit himself. And so of course, again, constitutional challenges right there. And the latest thing is on this thing Tuesday was the primaries. And we saw that one of President Trump's most outspoken Republican critics has now been defeated in the most expensive House primary in American history, right? So Kentucky Congressman Thomas Massie lost to Trump-backed challenger Ed Guerlin after a brutal campaign fueled by tens of millions of dollars in outside spending and intense pressure on the pro-Trump and pro-Israel political groups. This made waves because Thomas Massey essentially sat down with Tucker Carlson. Megyn Kelly has been, and if you remember, Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, they were pro-MAGA. They were supporters of President Trump, big supporters of helping him get back into the White House for his second terms, and they have essentially been critical of President Trump because of the Iran war. Thomas Massey, who was, essentially been pro on President Trump's election campaign promises of ending forever wars, prioritizing America first, essentially has been critical of the president because of the Iran war. And then you have about $32 million that was spent in terms of getting him, out of the primaries, right? And out of that, about shy of 10 million came from Israeli-backed, AIPAC. To be able to push for his opponent. So this is very critical because it's, again, showing more outside foreign influence of Israel in American politics, and Thomas Massey losing where he essentially aligned with President Trump's policies prior to President Trump being elected, and then President Trump turning his back on his own policies, like having forever wars, and not, prioritizing America first. So this is massive because this is going to, again, have a lot of pushback from some of the people who have defected from MAGA. But this also shows that President Trump has influence when it comes to MAGA movement, when it comes to Republican politicians who are not siding with him on everything, which is why probably Vice President J.D. Vance is saying, we're locked and loaded when to Iran, when he initially has always been against the war with Iran, showing that, President Trump does have influence, but it also shows that Israel, through AIPAC, is definitely spending money on making sure that they elect the right politicians that back the agenda. So it's very critical time, and we're seeing a lot of things come out. Like, for example, Latino supporters for Trump are weakening. We saw that increase in the last election in 2024. And now when it comes to new polling suggesting that Latino voters are drifting away from Trump, saying that, 52% say that they remain undecided ahead of the midterms. 73% say that they are just surviving financially, that, in Trump's America, things have become more expensive. Inflation numbers are through the roof. And again, they don't understand, why President Trump went into war with Iran, which has caused these inflation numbers. When it comes to small business, they're saying that they're being affected. Small business profits are being affected as they now are spending 31% more on gasoline than prior to President Trump being in office than a year ago. And as we're seeing the national average of gas prices go up to $4.56 a gallon, that's over $6 a gallon in states like California. So small businesses are also roughly saying that, hey, where does this mean? If it's impacting our profits, then that affects, as small businesses create roughly half of all new jobs in the United States. So that's massive on when it comes to inflation impacting what is Main Street, America, which is small businesses. So that's having massive repercussions. Now, in entertainment story, we have very little time left. I do want to tell you that Drake has essentially made another wave of things happen here in Toronto. As Drake surprisingly, he launched his music video. There you see in his music video, go full screen if you can, where he's got on his fur jacket right there in his music video. And to that, you had Sleep Country kind of go quick on that entire thing as Drake is promoting, these Canadian brands. And they said that they were going to have a sale, 24-hour sale. And this essentially led Canadians in Toronto at 8 King Street East in Toronto, if they were to wear bold fur coats or fake coats, doesn't matter, but fur to nonetheless, that they could claim a free queen-sized Casper mattress. So, of course, you see there's a lineup of Torontonians around the store in Sleep Country to be able to claim it. And you see some of them are wearing their fur coats. And this is something that the CEO Sleep Country Canada essentially made headlines saying that, you know what, why don't we just jump on this bandwagon? Drake is the most recognized Torontonian celebrity. And if he's going to promote our brands in his music video, then we're going to, strive on that. So it raises a question on when it comes to brand placement and strategic marketing that in this case went very viral. That's all the time we have on Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh. Until tomorrow, take care and be well.